During the summer, our programs feature our members, and today I have the privilege of introducing one of the newest members of our Board of Trustees, and a member of multiple committees, I believe, Glenda Kenyon, who will be speaking to us about fair housing as part of our ongoing programming related to living ethics. Glenda was born in Chicago and was raised in the Catholic school system until the age of 12 when her family moved to Oak Park. In high school, she flourished in the backstage end of theater and became a house manager for the usher program her senior year. She went on to graduate from Vassar with a double degree in drama and economics in 2009, just in time to enjoy the recession. After a year of trying to get a foothold in theater, she started her first full-time job as a leasing agent in Arlington Heights. This soon became a career that Glenda enjoyed, so she stuck to it and within 4 years became a property manager for a five property portfolio based in Chicago. When she's not working, she's busy either getting ready for a game night with her friends, walking with her husband 3 miles to justify an ice cream cone, or enjoying a coloring book while listening to some true crime. Welcome, Glenda.
Hey guys, before I officially start, a couple of things. When I'm really excited to do something, I kind of dance to myself, so if I move around, please don't be distracted. And second, I'm really thirsty, so I'm going to get a drink. Yeah, I know, that was class act. So thank you guys for coming out today for my presentation called, well, I don't know why everyone must engage in neighborhood equality, or I am fair housing, and so can you. So to get us started, we should answer the question of what exactly is fair housing. So inspired by the Chicago freedom movement from the 1950s and 60s, which saw a spur of community action in Chicago to stop slums with community involvement, including tenant unions, soon after they enacted the Fair Housing Act, which was part of the Civil Rights Act. It also came soon after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was very active in the movement in Chicago when it came to the grassroots organization of it. And it was the Fair Housing Act was put in place to prevent the discrimination in the sale or rental of housing nationally. It was originally protected from discrimination based on your race, color, religion, or national origin. And then in 1974, sex became a protected class, which sex is technically not gender, so that makes things currently awkward for a very more open-minded view of looking at things these days. And then in 1988, familial status and disability status were added thanks in part to the American with Disabilities Act. And states typically add to this list of protected classes from their fair housing addendums. So currently in Illinois, for an example, we also protect against discrimination based on your ancestry, age, which is specifically those over 40 years old, your marital status, your citizenship status, any order of protection, like restraining orders, sexual orientation, including gender-related identity, unfavorable discharge from military service, pregnancy, and recently arrest record was added to that as well. Cities, townships, counties, and other municipalities can also add additional protected classes. So for example, since 2014 in Cook County, they now added source of income as a protected class as well. Before the Fair Housing Act was enacted, there was a good number of appalling practices in place. So let's go over a few of what those are called and what that means. First, you have redlining, which is the practice of de-investing in certain areas based on a map historically marked with a red line. And these were based on maps during the New Deal, when the government would invest in green, white neighborhoods and avoided projects in red neighborhoods with high populations of African Americans. And so previously it was primarily used by banks to decide on loans for purchasing property, but then real estate agents took hold of those maps to only lease to certain people in certain areas. And that kind of segues into what steering is, which is the practice of only showing neighborhoods to certain populations and deterring populations from seeking homes from other neighborhoods. Like in the past in Chicago, if you had a black family that was looking to buy a home, you would steer them away from the north side and steer them towards the west side and the south side. So to give an example. There's also block busting, which is when a real estate agent encourages the sale of someone's home because a certain protected class has moved in, which is literally the encouragement of white flight for the business benefit of a real estate agent. And previously, in addition to these specially named kinds of discrimination, real estate offices and even members of a neighborhood could put up signs just saying that they wouldn't do business or allow certain protected classes to move in, including in advertising. You could just kind of like how we all know that classic sign of Irish need not apply. It was just basically, yeah, Irish need not apply for this apartment either. So a subtler tactic was also to increase rent rates or loans on undesirable protected classes. So it's almost kind of like encouraging that, oh, well, this black family is a higher risk family, so we're going to give them a higher loan interest rate on the house that they're buying. So on top of all this, if prevention of a protected class was to buy or rent housing became violent, it wasn't labeled a hate crime. So if, like, there's a lot of stories of if a black family moved into a neighborhood and then their house got firebombed or they got beat up, that was just assault or destruction of property. It wasn't included as a hate crime previously. So let's give a kind of example of how this worked. So we're going to start with Donna King. This is a picture of her as a baby, but she was a child in 1965, elementary school aged. Her parents wanted to be homeowners, and they were in the Woodlawn area. So they decided to buy a home in the South Shore, which at the time in 1965 was a primarily white neighborhood. So they became the second black family on that block. As soon as they moved in, white families moved out, which pretty much there's been a lot of confirmation of what's called block busting, as I mentioned before, in the South Shore. And a couple of real estate agents ended up making a ton of money scaring a bunch of white families out of neighborhoods that happened to just have a new black family move in. So, and because all these white families were rushing out, there was this increase in supply of the housing there, so the prices dropped. And then, of course, because of steering, you only had black families move in. So within 5 years, Donna remembers that she went to school that was, mostly white people, but within 5 years when she graduated 8th grade, she only had one fellow white student in her graduating class. It was a Catholic school, but still. It was based on the neighborhood at the time. So, the effect of the Fair Housing Act. Let's talk about that. With the Fair Housing Act in place, the Department of Housing and Urban Development took over regulation. It was newly configured in 1965, and at first it was just supposed to help on a federal level with city development, and then they just kind of added in the Fair Housing Act implementation as well soon in 1968. Violations can be Violations can be arbitrated through HUD, Housing and Urban Development, and you don't have to go to a typical court, but a lot of people also go through court as well. Federal complaints involve audits and interviews, and if HUD or a court finds fault, it typically leads to fines levied to the company or the individual responsible for the discriminatory action, or most times both. So say if in my office I discriminated against someone because of their familial status to leasing them a one-bedroom, they could take me to court, and not only would my company be fined, but I would be fined as well. And then the great part is, then my company can fire me and then sue me for what they lost in the fines levied against them because they trained me to not be a jerk. So yeah, so that happens. So. Your ability to practice real estate in a particular state can also be removed as well, depending on the local legislation. In Illinois, we have licenses for anybody who's in real estate or dealing with anything of that sort, so it's really easy for Illinois to be like, we don't want you to have this anymore. So, and it's kept on record by HUD and can be found by the public as well. States typically have expanded to not only add protected classes to fair housing, but require training in fair housing. In Illinois, they not only require fair housing education for real estate licensees initially, but also regular continuing education that includes a review of fair housing. This incentivizes companies to have internal training, or firms offer such training as well outside of the company. Anyone that is providing a loan for housing must also abide by the law. In addition, consumers must be aware that any company doing real estate business abides to these rules. This includes putting up the previously shown poster saying that you follow fair housing, and making sure the equal housing logo, which is right there, the equal housing logo is on any advertising. Recently, this has included the handicap symbol to indicate compliance with ADA regulation. One thing to add, this law does not say that someone that is a customer can't come in with biases. However, this doesn't mean that the person that is selling housing now has permission to discriminate for the customer. So I can have a customer come in and ask, hey, you know, I just like living around Japanese people. Is that cool? And I could be like, well, that's great, but I don't know where they are. And even if I do know, I just have to navigate according to other needs. So things like that. So about how this affects me professionally. As you can see, this very professional picture of me and my leasing agent up here. I deal with fair housing on a daily basis in my career. I've been in residential property management since November 2010, and through that I can speak about it in a practical context. First, the biggest one it affects is advertising. So not only do we have the logos like I mentioned before, and making sure it's, in Illinois, you have to, I'm a leasing agent, which is like the lowest rung of training necessary to be participating in any kind of housing sale. So because of that, it's only 15 hours of required class before and then 6 hours of continuing education every 2 years. So because of that, I have to have what's called a sponsoring broker. So somebody with a broker's license who's had to gone through many more hours of training has to sponsor me. So anytime I advertise for the apartments that I sell, we have to make sure that sponsoring broker is either a company name or the sponsoring broker's name as an individual as well. And then on top of that, in practice that I've seen at my own job, for several companies I worked for, there's a whole group philosophy of advertising where you don't want to put people up on any of your advertising. So I know that we've seen a lot of times when people are trying to sell condos or homes or rentals, they'll put up these happy smiling families. But the problem is if you don't include enough diversity, quote unquote, in those pictures of people, you can be accused of steering different people into living on your property. So you're like, if somebody says, well, I don't see any disabled people in those pictures, so you violated the law. Well, technically you could have, and the Supreme Court has ruled recently that it doesn't matter if there's any intent or not, you've broken the law. So a lot of my bosses and superiors basically say, don't ever put people in advertising. So it's one of those strange little things that affects it. And then throughout the entire process of trying to sell what I sell, which is apartments, the tour, when somebody first comes in, we have to make sure we get what we call a guest card. We ask them the same kinds of questions about what they're looking for, where they're coming from, how to contact them, and we have to make sure we ask them the same questions every time. So that way, if somebody feels like that they were treated differently when they came into our rental office, my leasing agent and I can produce these guest cards and say, we do the same thing for everyone looking for apartments here. So that's a little piece of evidence. On top of it's just good, marketing numbers to keep as well, but it's really more important, in my opinion, to have it for HUD compliance. And then once somebody wants to have an apartment, the application process has to be the same for everyone, regardless of any kind of exceptions you may give. So they have to go through the same credit check. They have to do the same criminal check. You have to have the same income qualifications for everyone. And you can't have like, well, this guy seemed all right. You have to base it on the numbers on a piece of paper. You can't base it on anything else that's in your gut. As much as you get a good gut over time, you just can't use it anymore. Then there's a consistency in protocol that happens as you live in your apartment. So I cannot just be a nice person to one person because I know they're a good resident, and if somebody's a bad resident, not be as nice to them. So anytime somebody asks me a favor, they get really upset when I say no because they're like, but you like me. You know I'm a good renter. I pay my rent on time. And it has nothing to do with that. It's more about the fact that if I do somebody a favor once, I have to be willing to do that same favor for every single resident who lives on the property as well. So, and anytime I have to change a protocol regarding that, I always send in an email to my leasing agent so there's a written record of it. So that way they know this is the date where the protocol changed. And if anybody tries to come at me saying that you were being unfair, you could just say, no, this was a business decision. Here's the paper evidence of that. And staff training as well. P.S. My leasing agent, Pam, those are her glasses. This was her idea. I just want to clarify that. But one of the things that I have to do in my job as a property manager is I have to make sure that my leasing agent and my maintenance staff and anybody else who works for us knows about fair housing protocol and treating everyone fairly. Unfortunately, I can't check with every vendor who's fixing my heating, my carpentry, and everything and make sure that they follow it. But it's one of those things where if I know a company has some biases, I'd have to let them go. So, and the same with my staff. Now, luckily, Pam totally gets it, so I haven't had to worry about her. Maintenance, I can get into that later, but I did have an incident once where somebody was like, you can trust me, I'm not a basic white guy. And I'm like, ooh, you can't say that. And he wasn't working directly for the company, so we were kind of sort of okay, but it almost got us in trouble. So, and careful about language and preferential treatment, like the consistency and protocol, and also being careful in language with when somebody comes to you saying something, as much as it might be offensive, just because they could take offense, you just kind of have to swallow it and nod and be like, okay, yeah, no, you know what? You could pay rent a little late, just remember late fee, bye. Oh, God, get out of my office. So that happens not regularly, luckily, considering we're in Chicago, but it has happened to me before. And as much as, a lot of you know me as being very opinionated and open about equality and such, there are certain things that I have to bite my tongue with at work. So we'll get into some examples about stuff later. So, like many legislative actions, people breathe easy when the law is passed. But the problem is assuming that the law is enough to do the work. And as many of you are aware, there have been plenty of problems after the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was passed. So let's continue on with the story of Donna King. So in 1980, she decides to make her way to Boston, and she lives with some friends, but decides to find her own apartment as well. She looks up listings in the newspaper and makes calls, and she's always really good at keeping appointments. But as soon as she arrives, the landlord would look at her and say, apartment is already leased before you arrived. Every single time. So she ended up spending one fall in Boston, and by the winter said screw it, and she moved back to Chicago where she could handle the area better. And I will concede the point that Boston's kind of a crazy city because it's got a crazy kind of history to it, which I won't get into because it's another presentation on its own. But this is kind of a consistent thing that happens with a lot of people that experience discrimination in housing. So she's not only a case study, she's also my mother. Unknowingly, I had accidentally learned about the need for fair housing from when I was young, since Donna King became my mother in 1986. So these were stories that she told to warn me about the way the world worked in general, not knowing that these would become applicable in my career. Water break. I'm sorry, I don't want to talk with a dry mouth. That would be really scary. So my own experiences with that advice that my mother gave me before she knew it would be applicable did help translating the training I received when I first started. So at my first job, I was told that if I didn't follow fair housing, I can incur a $25,000 fine. So that was pretty good motivation to follow the law at first. At my current company, we have annual training. So even though licensees only have to do it every other year, to cover their ground, and especially since my current company also works with a lot of affordable housing, they make sure every year that we're trained in fair housing. So it did not stop me, however, with the training I've had at any of my previous companies from experiencing potential violations. So the biggest thing was the change of having the source of income become a protected class in Cook County. So in about, I want to say 2012, 2013, Cook County said that you can't discriminate based on source of income, which really means you can't discriminate if somebody has a housing voucher from a government institution or any other kind of charity that is subsidizing their rent. And when I first had this law, there was 2 companies ago I worked with in Displays. And that companies, luckily, they were overcharging their rents too high, so I wasn't have to worry about that anyway. The housing vouchers weren't going to affect it. But then I moved to a company where it was more of a property that would be able in that price range for that housing assistance. And my boss at the time didn't know the law, so I mentioned it to her, and she mentioned it to the regional manager. And the regional manager just said, no, we're not going to accept vouchers anyway. So that was awkward. Then sometimes the office did have a culture where the employment share invalidated their personal prejudices, especially if we were in a property that had a certain minority population. There are just certain things, I won't repeat, that were said, including these residents have made me, well, I'll say this one, these residents have made me racist. And it's like, no, you made yourself racist by validating your own opinions with a bad resident. But I can't say anything because I'm at work. So there you go. So that would happen sometimes. And again, it doesn't happen in my company right now, partly because I manage my own office. And another reason is because just Pam and I grew up in cultures where we just kind of better understood discrimination, so we're a lot more careful to not discriminate. Another thing that could be a slippery slope is engaging with the residents' prejudices when they came up. One horrible story I'll tell you is that I was in the office with, I was the assistant manager at this company, and there was a leasing agent there, and he was talking with a resident at his desk. And this resident talked about, well, these nuts, you know, the only name I know for them is N-word toe. So that's a Brazil nut? That's the actual name for it? So that was a really awkward when I said, you know, it's called a Brazil nut. And that was all I could really say. I couldn't tell her, you know, maybe stop going around saying N-word toe. It's kind of weird. And then that got really awkward in a flash. I won't even waste your time with that story, but that was all I could do. I can't, like, admonish somebody for having a really bad choice of phrasing. I also had one time, I was giving a tour at a different company before, and the last name of the people, I forget, they were from some part of Europe, and the last name of the individuals looking for an apartment was Negru, N-E-G-R-U, and they thought it was funny if they said the N-word to say that's how you pronounce it. And I was like, no, it's not funny, but I can't say anything, so I'm just going to pretend you never said that, sure. So weird little stuff. So, and at the property I worked at before, the same one with the great Brazil nut story, we had to do a HUD audit at our property because a non-renewal was contested due to bias against familial status. So what happened was there were a lot of noise complaints, and for us it's really just about the noise complaints. They asked me about it, and I said it's a business decision, and legally you can non-renew anybody for a business decision. They asked my manager, it was a business decision. They asked the regional manager, who was smart enough to say, oh, I hear your kids are noisy. And then it became a familial status complaint. So right before I left that company, I had to get the HUD audit paperwork ready. I've had to watch myself because being nice is not a legal argument against inconsistent service. And I get a lot of residents, like including recently, there was a resident who's been a great resident. His parents are also in property management too, so he kind of sort of understands. But he was going to move out at the end of July. And he wanted me to be like, oh, it's okay, to prorate his rent till 2-3 days so he could keep his couch in the apartment for part of August. And the reason I don't do this is because if I do it for a nice person who I know is going to do it, I have to do it for somebody else who's going to use it as an excuse to essentially say, oh, well, now I'm just going to stay for another month, and another month, and another month. So this resident got really upset with me because he's like, I think you're just looking at this too black and white. And I'm just thinking to myself, I get paid to look at it black and white, has nothing to do with you, has everything to do with the law. But a lot of residents, they get a bad taste in their mouth after something like that. And they thought that, you know, and I like to be friendly and get to know people and talk with them about them and their families. And then they feel jilted that I had to follow the letter of the law, but that's just the way the cookie crumbles. So. And then I can't engage in prejudicial conversation with residents or even relate on certain levels. One of the best stories I have for this is my first leasing agent job in Arlington Heights. And I'll remember the guy's name. Mike Spakowski, because this was one of my first big lessons in fair housing. So he came by, and he actually had a referral from somebody, so I read his name. I was like, oh, Mike Spakowski. And he goes, you said that really well. And I said, yeah. At the time, my boyfriend, now husband, he's like, oh, yeah, my boyfriend is Polish. His last name's Shemiat. So I kind of learned how to do this. And I gave him the tour. It was perfectly pleasant and nice. I came back, and the property manager at the time set me aside. She goes, I know you were relating to him, and you were trying to be nice, but you pointed out his name was Polish. You can't do that. So it can feel a little almost like micromanaging, but it really is just there to make sure that there's no even accidental biases as well. So it's not just anecdotal evidence, which is what I've been giving you now. Let's get to some data. A study published in 2014 by the National Fair Housing Alliance revealed that rental properties in communities of color were on average twice as likely to have upkeep issues than those in white communities, including damaged doors, trash strewn around, holes penetrating through exterior walls, and boarded up windows. The National Fair Housing Alliance also publishes a Fair Housing Trends Report annually. In their report looking back at 2016, they found that over 28,000 of reported acts of discrimination were made that year. The leading reason for complaints of housing discrimination was disability at 55%, followed by racial discrimination at almost 20%, and then familial status at almost 9%. And then 70% of these complaints were actually filed through a private advocacy group and not through the current federal systems in place. And in addition to what this organization found, HUD had previously suggested that housing discrimination is underreported and estimates around 4 million acts of housing discrimination happen each year. A 2010 study from the U.S. Government Office of Accountability saw that HUD would grant projects partly on an analysis of impediment and then not follow up with them. The idea of these analyses of impediment, which in the paper were referred to as AIs, was to find if there was anything restrictive about a project for any protected class and then implement solutions to alleviate these restrictions. The study found that 29% of AIs studied were more than 5 years old, and HUD had not asked them to be updated. In addition, the current AIs at the time were vague about timetables if they had them at all. To give credit to HUD, they began a huge revamp of the process of evaluating any analyses of impediment starting in 2011 after the report. And then in 2015, with leadership from the Obama administration, a new rule was developed called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. This rule required jurisdictions receiving funding to not only detail discriminatory impediments that affected the projects receiving funding, but would also have to give direct responses on how to overcome these with more detailed facts and timetables, which were actually provided by the federal government. Critics argued that they didn't see any potential punishments for jurisdictions that didn't follow the plan properly, but this rule actually gave jurisdictions access to better information about their communities on the whole as they worked on it, which in theory could lead to better plans to battle these impediments. I just got to sneak this water next to me. Oh, my gosh. Oh. However, we have to keep in mind that currently the administration in the White House has a dismal record with understanding the needs of HUD before they took office. Yes, I purposely picked out bad pictures. No, I am not ashamed. So, in 1973, the Justice Department sued Donald Trump, his father Fred, and Trump management for explicit practices of not renting any of their developments to African Americans. This was a policy that was in place and told to all Trump management employees. Trump tried to sue the Justice Department back for false allegations, and the courts threw those claims out. So in 1975, he finally settled, and Trump management had to not discriminate. They did not have to admit guilt, although the evidence against them was quite damaging. It was literally telling employees, if a black person comes in, you tell them there's nothing there. There'll be a sign on the street, and a black customer would come in and say, hey, what do you have for rent? And it's like, oh, that sign's old. We just rented it. Every single time. And literally, when the employees were confronted with this information, Essentially, they told the advocacy group that was doing these test tours, oh no, but that's what the boss says, I have to do it. I'm sorry, I have to. So, Trump appointed Ben Carson as the head of the development of HUD. There's some issues with this. One is that Ben Carson's experiences as a neurosurgeon, which, while impressive, is not quite the same as public works on a federal level. In addition, he publicly criticized Obama for implementing the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, saying that actions like that in the past had failed. He compared it to busing actions in the 70s and 80s, which, although were prompted by federal rulings, was mostly organized on the state or local level. And in fact, currently, some southern communities are very proud of their success of their busing programs with integrating their schools. And northerners who have insulted the South before, a lot of those communities will say, we have the best busing program, our kids are diverse, So it was not a fair comparison. Currently, fair housing advocates are pretty much hoping that the Trump administration will just leave the current rules alone, especially now that they're distracted with other matters, and Carson has briefly mentioned he's pro-fair housing. As I was working on this presentation, the Attorney General's office decided to fight the notion that the Civil Rights Act protects people based on sexual orientation. So this is just proving to further complicate what we have the current administration in office. And I think an administration who's going to actually take the time to fight the idea of affirmative action might, if you let certain people stay in office, continue to fight the idea of fair housing down the line. So, as much as I just hurled a small portion of the many worries advocates of fair housing have, I don't want you to think I'm here without hope. Because during my own research that I do for fun because I'm a nerd, something struck me. My brother suggested that I read the Fair Housing and Equity Assessment for Metropolitan Chicago. He knew it through CMAP, the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. It was published with the Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance in November of 2013. This report shows that the metropolitan area of Chicago is increasing its racial diversity when you purely look at the statistics, but is also still segregated in spite of this diversity. One of the most telling indicators was the racially concentrated areas of poverty, which 5 out of the 7 counties in the study had at least 5 or more of these areas, which a racially concentrated area of poverty was essentially when the majority of a part of a neighborhood was under the poverty level and 90% or more of the same race. However, what struck me the most was a quote that was taken from a survey of municipality leaders in the area, which was shared after the report to showed with, I'm sorry, I'm totally stumbling over everything. Let me start this over. So what struck me the most was a quote that was taken from a survey of municipality leaders in the area, which was shared after the report showed with quantitative certainty that Greater Chicagoland had a problem on its hands specifically with racial diversity. This is the quote, which I'm going to read off of the board because this is very professional. Organizations such as yours always seem to assume that there is a problem with fair housing and look to implement programs that are not necessary in order to justify your existence. Maybe we need to accept the fact that in many cases, many communities have moved past the 1960s and fair housing is not the same issue. Maybe we have grown and perhaps these resources can be redirected in other areas. So I invite you all to read the Fair Housing and Equity Assessment and then get to this quote and try not to jump out of your chair in astonishment with this sense an insane level of cognitive dissonance. Not only was this municipality leader contradicting the situation shown by verifiable facts through a multitude of statistical analysis, but was also stating this while leading a municipality who at the time had to literally write analysis of impediment to receive funding for their community in order to receive funding directly from HUD. Obviously, this leader wasn't concerned about what was shown through these analyses. What this quote revealed to me personally is that there is a line of thinking that somehow is promoted to such a level that even those who are supposed to work under the guidance for fair housing don't see the value of promoting diversity on multiple fronts. The report I just quoted from revealed that almost half of the respondents of the survey reported that there were no fair housing issues in their communities, despite the report showing that all 7 counties had issues with racial segregation, as well as having 5 counties which had a significant number of racially concentrated areas of poverty. Now, I'll admit, this is where I'll get into my own opinions on the subject, but these numbers and responses, as well as some of my own experiences and the experiences of my family, tell me a story of an ingrained attitude, a common line of thinking, and a culture that says that what we've done is enough despite what the evidence says. When I think about fighting back a way of thinking that essentially shapes whole communities, I feel we have to admit that what we have to do is slowly change the culture around us. Currently, this culture has said that the government will regulate this on their own. I think with now more than 50 years of HUD and local organizations supposedly taking the lead on this, the evidence shows that's not enough. With that being said, I want to invite everyone into thinking about how they can engage on a local level to better their communities. I want you to come away from this talk doing small-scale things that can hopefully add up. I'm hoping you'll also encourage others to start thinking and acting in some small ways and some big ways in hopes that we can plant seeds for trees that later generations can sit in the shade of. So let's get started with my own personal advice. First, don't assume that your community is doing everything that they can. This is a problem where vigilance is the key to the solution. As soon as someone says the work is over is when any effort to ensure diversity starts to fall apart. The Fair Housing and Equity Assessment is just one example of that. Second, we have to admit that we have been born in a world, let alone a country, where there are a lot of issues with segregation, whether forced or otherwise. We have all grown up with at least an inkling of this being normal and what we consider a quote-unquote normal community that we are comfortable living in. Keep this in mind when it comes to your housing choices. It's unfair for me to judge a whole room of people for any particular set of biases, so I'm going to just encourage yourself to ask hard questions, especially when it comes to your community and who you'd prefer to share it with you. And especially if you're a homeowner, if you have a welcoming custom that you do or a group of individuals do when someone new moves in next to you or on your block, do the same practice with everyone. It may seem weird to not individualize it, but knowing that there's a routine to make sure that everyone is welcome makes it easier for anyone who's part of a protected class to know that they're not being treated differently. If you don't do anything to welcome your neighbors, rest assured that gives you an excuse to not welcome everyone equally. Understandably, relationships with neighbors will evolve as they settle in and you get to know them, which is fine. This is more of an idea of practicing that consistent protocol idea that fair housing asks professionals to do. Speaking of professionals, one of the biggest things to do is hold them accountable. If you're entering any office where someone is participating in a real estate practice, make sure that they have that fair housing poster hanging up somewhere in that office, the one that I showed in the earlier slides. If not, be sure to ask why that isn't hung up and if they're following fair housing law. If you observe questionable behavior, feel free to at least mention your suspicions to either HUD or a private organization who can collect complaints and initiate an investigation of their own. You don't have to feel like you should confront professionals. Don't feel like you have to confront a real estate agent or a leasing agent or anybody like that. But you should report any issues you observe or experience to someone who has the resources to see if there's a fair housing violation. One thing my research has confirmed for me is that it's that the local level politics are what really drive the enforcement of fair housing rules and ethics. Yes, it is very important that the White House and your governor's office are committed as well. But a lot of these decisions are driven by mayors, judges, township boards, and a plethora of local level positions that make decisions that not only affect who can move in, but the quality of the neighborhood that people already live in. Voting people in who will at least have a fair housing mindset when they make these decisions will help prevent segregation and impediments to your protected classes, no matter what kind of housing in your community. A big idea I hope I can promote is that affordable housing has received a lot of bad press. However, the majority of the situations I've seen where an affordable housing situation has gone afoul had more to reflect the quality of the landlord or management company maintaining or selling the property. If a complex of affordable housing is coming up near you that participates in government-sponsored voucher program or similar type funding, rest assured that there are standards that have to be met to maintain that funding for the residents, including a lack of criminal history and at least a minimal maintenance of their apartment. They also cannot just let anyone move in with them without having gone through a vetting process. These programs are structured so lower income individuals or families are able to have disposable income, which can have at least a small benefit to your community. Also, the majority of these programs help working single parents, the elderly, or those with disabilities. And many of these people would be homeless without these services. I will say that for myself, I would rather have a disabled person sleeping in an apartment or home next to me than in a couple seats on the Blue Line where I commute every morning. Finally, support local efforts by fair housing advocacy groups. As I mentioned before, they make up 70% of the work to respond to any fair housing complaints, and they're truly spreading awareness better than any other current organization, including those in the government. These are the efforts that will help change the common line of thinking that affect our communities today. If you can, donate, attend events, stay informed, and if you suddenly have a bunch of spare time, see about getting involved with these community groups as well. This is just the start, and more opportunities that I haven't mentioned may arrive to help keep your communities diverse or make them even more so. To end on a high note, a lot of my mother's housing woes came to a halt when my parents bought a house in Oak Park late in 1998. Oak Park has received many accolades for their continued efforts to keep that area diverse ever since the 60s, including buying homes at fair market value to discourage white flight and having their own housing center that helps renters find housing throughout all of Oak Park. My mother was the primary shopper for the house since she was more particular of the layout and conditions than my dad. Don't bring that up to them, they're here today. We were able to work with a realtor who showed us houses anywhere in the town that fit the basic niche that my mother was looking for. And even the majority of people selling their homes were welcoming to our family as we looked for a while. Finally, we found one in November and moved in. My mom hasn't had any housing-related discrimination since, but that it does help that you own your own place and then you stay put. So, for me, I want everyone who has the experience my family had when we found our home in '98. I want everyone to have opportunities without unnecessary barriers. There's no reason that we can't all be good neighbors to one another. The qualities in life a person can't choose shouldn't dictate where they can live the rest of their life. Currently, that's the state in America. And when you think about it, it's the only thing that's stopping us isn't the government not enforcing the laws that unfortunately they've prioritized. What's stopping us is this thinking that we have to live homogeneously. So let's change our thinking. Thank you, everyone.
Hello.
Hey!
Have you ever reported your own company for a violation?
Oh, that I have not. It's because I am not comfortable enough economically to not have a job for a significant period of time. Does that make me maybe ethically dubious? Maybe, and I do that, but it just was never economically feasible. I'm the breadwinner of my family. I can't, it wouldn't have been, and especially for the company I worked at before, when Greg and I were moving in together and figuring out when we could get married, it just wouldn't have been fair to him to say, hey, we're going to do this radical crusade. You in it with me? And he'd be like, no. Because you'd be like, so where are we going to live? Are we going to live with my parents? I don't want to live with my parents. And so that kind of stuff. No.
What about contract selling? It used to be a big problem in the 50s, 60s. Does it still continue?
I'm sure there's still problems with contract selling. I mean, I've heard so much, and I don't have any numbers, unfortunately, but I've heard so much anecdotal evidence about, selling, or I've seen reports where people still are getting higher interest rates. So I think the biggest problem with that is underreporting. People don't, I mean, as I mentioned before, for me economically, I don't have the time to report my own company if I work for a bad company. I just change to a different company, and I don't give them my talent, which I think is pretty great, to be honest. So, that's how I try to contribute to the betterment of the system. But a lot of people, I mean, I mean, it's housing. It's one of the desperate needs that you have that you can't comfortably live without. So I think a lot of people don't want to be caught up in a lawsuit or a HUD complaint or anything like that. And but I'm pretty sure it still happens. Maybe not as bad as the 50s, 60s, but I don't have the numbers to confirm that. So.
Thank you. Generating housing sales by real estate people through fear, namely the fear of growing taxes in Chicago. Is that considered illegal or just smart business?
It's not illegal. It's not illegal because it's about a factual and also an easily verifiable numeric situation. So it's not, in the sense of fair housing, it's not illegal. I think ethically it could be bad because taxes are high because taxes pay for goods and services that we all receive if we live in a city. So, and on top of that, if you know that in American society, the majority of the wealthy happen to be of a certain either race or demographic of other ways, and it's going to chase that demographic out and then possibly make more concentrated areas of poverty as, you know, the demand for housing goes down, whether it's a rental or a home ownership. I would say there's parts of it, they're still unethical, even though it's technically legal. So. Hey.
Hi, Glenda.
Hey.
One thing that struck me with your presentation is that if you are a landlord or want to become a landlord, it seems like it's very scary. Like there's a lot of ways that you could screw up. I'm just wondering if there are any incentives or maybe people that you've met or landlords you've worked with that really enjoy being a landlord or have found it beneficial.
Well, first of all, one of the things I'll say is that fair housing law only counts if the landlord or owner has 6 or less units, and if they reside in one of those units, that kind of counts. I mean, if they have 6 or less units, that means that the complaint will not be pursued. Because after a point, that's just tedium and an easy way to do back and forth. Now, landlords that enjoy being landlords. I do not work with a lot of people on the lower personal level that happen to have, you know, only a few properties. I will say that the thing that I do notice that currently, at least in Chicagoland, and this is anecdotal, so don't quote me on it for anything serious, but a lot of landlords I've noticed that are in Chicagoland are actually immigrants. So it's one of the easiest ways if you're an immigrant, and it doesn't matter where you are from as an immigrant, if you're just an immigrant that has the income when you first come in to buy a property, revamp it, and then rent it, it's one of the ways that immigrants are able to get a good foothold in America and get land ownership and equity and then be able to build off for their later generations of then red-blooded Americans. So, yeah.
Hi, Glenda. Great talk. Question. My company runs a couple of different properties, but in my property is about 30 units, I think. And they send out emails regularly asking for tenants to become apartment showers, to walk people through and actually open doors and show them each of the parts of the building. Can you talk about what sort of expectation that person, like would they fall into one of these categories, and then what expectation of training would apply in that situation?
Yeah, so your company would be liable if there is any discrimination based on the tenant who's showing it. So in situations like that, if you have somebody who doesn't have, in Illinois in particular, you have to have a leasing agent license if you're going to be participating in any sort of leasing. If you're not a leasing agent and you have to rely on somebody else, in theory what you need to do is give this person a sheet and say, these are the facts, you read off the sheet, you do not say anything else. So and typically when I've done that for like when a maintenance person is showing an apartment, it's based on square footage and the price that they're going to be offered and everything like that. Of course, I'm almost positive that a smart run company doesn't want their residents knowing the price that they're going to re-rent their apartment to. It's just kind of tricky on that. So what I would say that that's a dubious practice. And I'm not surprised that there's a company that does it, but I would suggest that you probably wouldn't get in trouble because you're not supposed to be in real estate business. But if there's any evidence that shows that you know that you shouldn't be, like, God forbid, if somebody knew you came to this talk, I wouldn't do it for them. I would just say, I'm really busy, I can't do it. Sorry, you can show it when I'm not home. Just give me 24 hours notice, which is what Chicago ordinance says that we should be doing. Or they should call you, if it's going to be a last minute, you can still give them permission, but the law technically says that you have to give at least 24-hour notice if you're going to just show it and, say, hey, we're going to show it regardless. So I wouldn't participate in that if you're not an agent. And if you're not an agent working for, and God forbid, like if I lived in one of those apartments and they asked me to show it, since I don't work for that company, I'm technically then doing dual representation, which is really bad for somebody who has a license, and I could lose my license over that. So there's a lot of reasons why your company shouldn't do it, and you should totally tell them they're mean. So, yeah. Hey, Chris.
Hi. Thank you for your talk.
Yeah.
I noticed you said that in Illinois, landlords cannot discriminate based on a person's arrest record. Mm-hmm. I have two questions, actually. The first is whether they can discriminate on actual convictions, criminal convictions. I'm assuming the answer is yes, but I'm interested.
Yeah.
And then my second question is, I've always heard that after the Great Recession, rental rates, the demand for rental housing went up, and I just wonder if that comports with your understanding.
Yeah. So for the first question, did I already forget the first question? Convictions, yes. So, when it comes to actual convictions, technically we can say that certain criminals are not allowed to enter housing. However, particularly in Cook County, there's been a lot of evidence that shows that because our justice system is racist, that it technically then makes basing it on your criminal history racist. So, and this is especially hard for, as I said, I work for a company now that has primarily affordable housing. It's really tricky for them. So, because they have to be, as soon as a law in any municipality or even on the federal level can change that, they immediately have to adhere to it. At my current office right now, we look at your arrest record, and as long as it's not anything like heavy trafficking or murder or anything super highly violent or, predatorily criminal, or like operating an illegal business outside in the apartment is a potential. We say basically, the crime that you've been accused of has to be 8 to 10 years away. Now it works really well, like if you've got somebody who had DOIs and then they cleaned up and everything like that. I think with affordable housing right now, and I don't want to speak for any certainty, but it's longer. So you can have some biases based on convictions, but I think right now the law is still trying to tease out how that works. In your second question with rental going up after the Great Recession, that's very true. And part of the reason is because people in my age group do not have the funds to put a down payment on there unless you get housing assistance. And some of us just culturally, like, I'll be perfectly honest, right now we're renters. I'm comfortable. I don't have to worry about repairing my house. I don't have to worry about doing my lawn or anything like that. And so since I don't currently have the opportunity to save up for a down payment, I'm not going to do it. I technically, on my husband's family, they want to give us a house, and if we get it, we'll take it. But if for some reason the opportunity wasn't there, I wouldn't be surprised if we chose to be lifelong renters, because we personally, as people, like to be able to not think about housing repairs or yard work or or even taxes. It's just nice not to worry. I'll pay to not worry about it. So I think that's part of that as well as just, millennials aren't making as much money as their predecessors would. So.
In past years, there's been controversy over the concept of integration maintenance. Some communities have, I'm told, implemented or tried to implement integration maintenance programs. Entities like the Oak Park Housing Center are putatively in the business of integration maintenance. And they have gotten a fair amount of heat for this from, for the most part, blacks who feel that their housing opportunities are being capped in some way. How widespread are programs of this sort now, and how controversial?
So I'll say that from my personal experience, they're not very widespread at all. Most communities don't, as I mentioned in the study, most communities don't see a need to do it. So, and I find it funny that there's these alleged complaints about integration caps, so to speak. There are no caps at the Oak Park Regional Housing Center. I went there before I got my last apartment thinking I might want to live in Oak Park instead of Forest Park where I live currently. It's not about quotas. They might steer you to some place that you never thought of before because it fits your needs and it just happens to be on a block you weren't considering to live on. But your personal preference then dictates where you live. So if there's anybody who has any caps, it's probably the people who go to Oak Park Regional Housing Center. So they're not implementing anything. The study from National Fair Housing Alliance, I believe it was, which I have sources if you need them. They basically suggest that a lot of people self-segregate. And unfortunately, in their studies, it suggested that white populations are the most likely to self-segregate. So that, in turn, because especially in an area that white's majority, that then proceeds to dictate where other populations may live. Now, controversial, I mean, it depends on the implementation. Right now, Oak Park Regional Housing Center is trying to do everything within fair housing law and doing things in a legal sense, but they're not pushing any kind of "you must live here" agenda. They're pushing "everyone is welcome here" agenda. And I'll say this: they were very welcoming to me, and my mother was helping me look, and they did not assume that there was a place that I wouldn't feel comfortable living. So they showed me a place that I would have been possibly fine with, but my husband was like, "Yeah, I don't want to live there." So that was me self-selecting where I was living. I have not had any experience with them doing that. And I can't speak to how controversial they are in other communities because I haven't worked in a community that has one. I've worked in Arlington Heights, Des Plaines, and in Chicago, and with some properties also in Indiana, and none of those communities have those. So I couldn't say from personal experience how controversial they are with the companies who have to work with them. So, yeah.
Hi. So I'm just curious, I guess a closely related topic to fair housing would be rent control.
Yeah.
And I was curious, as someone in the housing space, if you have any ideas about whether that's a possibility in Chicago, whether there's a movement for it, or if it's even a pro or a con that we should be thinking about.
Rent control is very tricky because on an economic level, you can be making certain rent prices higher for new people and then preventing people to be able to move in the future. Rent in Chicago and all across the country is growing really fast because the demand for rental has gone up, which again is associated with the economic situation of people in my generation. So I think a lot of people are scared that means that there'll be certain communities that will have to be kicked out because we are not accommodating those communities. And I think it has, I don't like the idea of rent control because in a lot of situations it ends up it inflates the current rent rates, you know. And you see that in New York, and you see that with their rental process, and it's so intense, so competitive, weird requirements. And if you want an apartment, if you see it same day, you got to apply it as soon as you see it. You can't sit and wait for it. And that's because of those rent controls. People are going to sit in those apartments that they have the rent control, and they're going to sit and they're going to die there. So they're going to be there for decades. And that affects the demand for everywhere else. I am more in favor for something that says we should be welcoming for everyone. We've got to accommodate for all socioeconomic classes, which in turn means, in America, in turn means usually being accommodating for all racial diversity as well, just because of how our history has made socioeconomic class very much tied to race. So instead of rent control, there's a couple other suggestions I would have, and I think the biggest one that comes to my mind is that we have to tell housing authorities to stop only giving vouchers for apartments that are cheap. I've had this problem with the Chicago Housing Authority. I could do a whole presentation about how much I hate how Chicago Housing Authority implements its protocol. There's no reason that the property I manage in Hyde Park is the only one getting vouchers when I also manage one in Lincoln Park. They should be equally willing to give vouchers to either property, which will in turn better how the market value reflects what the demand is in the city. But Chicago Housing Authority doesn't do that because they've apparently, from what I understand, they have a ton of money and they're just going to sit on it. So I won't go on that much further because that's all my personal feelings, and I don't want my job to suddenly say, why did you talk about CHA so bad? But I think that's one of the many things, at least in Chicago, that could help the situation rather than doing rent control.
Well, that was fascinating. I'm trying to keep up. I'm a very dense individual. But you did briefly mention a while back some things that Oak Park had done as regards purchasing houses at fair price and how that had prevented white flight. Can you talk about that more? I'm trying to understand how that works.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I found this out from my dentist. That's weird. But so one of the things that white flight does is that essentially the supply increases, and therefore since the supply increases and it's further than demand, to sell a house at a good market value to get better competition, you got to lower the price. And lowering the price lowers the value of the houses, which in turn lowers the perception of the community, which is really true in Chicago. So what Oak Park did is, especially along the side that borders Chicago, anytime there was like a white flight situation in the 60s after the riots and such, they bought the house, and then they would say, we're only selling at fair market value. Forget you, we're not, you know, there were a couple other things they did to help with that. So not only freezing the price of what they would sell those houses for to prevent just blanket white flight, they've also implemented a law that says you cannot put a sign that says that your house is for sale. It's completely illegal to this day. And what that prevents is the rumor mingling of why people are moving out. So your house will be for sale for even years, and nobody on your block has to know. So they have that, and then the Oak Park Regional Housing Center to help with the rental side of things. But it really was just a way to, Oak Park was really smart, and I don't know if they did it for humanist reasons or economic reasons, but either way it ended up working out well. But they were really smart as soon as they saw how some of their neighbor communities were changing and how tense it was, and there was other white flight going on. They said, let's do this in a way where people don't even realize we're preventing white flight. And it's held up to this day. It's very diverse compared to a lot of other parts of America. So,
I have a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned age discrimination specifically over the age of 40. Does that mean that it's okay to be like, ooh, I'm not renting to that, 22-year-old because they're probably irresponsible? Or,
I think in theory that would fall under age discrimination, but I think what it really is supposed to prevent is the idea that posh, expensive housing goes to young people. So I don't have a lot of information on that. And I'll be honest, there have been some people I wish I didn't have to rent to that were young and 22 and decided to puke all over my carpets. So, but I'm sure that will I'm sure you could use that to translate for discrimination against youth, because I know you can do that for work as well. If you fire somebody because they're too young, I had somebody who actually filed a complaint that way in New York about that. But I think they specifically say over the age of 40 to prevent places from, forcing a posh, hip kind of vibe so that they can get higher rent rates. So, yeah.
Okay, so I have a quick comment to your
Full
question,
disclosure,
Ray.
this is my mother.
And hello. And then I also have a question for you, Glenda. But,
okay.
When I started working again after, I'd stayed home with the kids for a while. When I started working again, I worked for a gentleman who owned a real estate company in Oak Park, and that was Rich Glore. And he was part of the group of people that started the Oak Park Housing Authority. So I got to meet all these people, these old timers who'd been around and helped to keep Oak Park from becoming segregated. And one group of people that got involved was the banks. And also people like Rich Glore and people, like the president of the Community Bank of Oak Park, River Forest.
Yeah.
They use their own personal credibility, I guess, to talk to some of the longtime residents who had houses that had appreciated a lot in value and who were scared and were thinking about moving. And I remember being in his office, Rich's office, and he talked to this gentleman who was in River Forest, because River Forest, they also include River Forest too. And this guy's house, he was about to sell it, and he bought it in the, you know, back in the 50s for maybe something like, I think it was like $50,000. It was a mansion, right? He was going to sell it for a couple of million. And Rich was telling him, aren't you glad I told you to stay in that house? And that's the kind of thing they did. They told people like that, stay in your house, don't move, don't sell. And he's a real estate guy. He owned a real estate company. And that helped a lot because the irony is, because the other neighborhoods around became more segregated socially and economically, Oak Park's housing value went up because there was diversity, and a lot of people wanted diversity, not just because they were in biracial families, but because there were a lot of people that felt that there was a value to getting to know different types of people within a safe environment. And they also pushed that diversity mantra in the schools. You know, it's even on the school calendar. You know, this is what we believe in. You have a certain rights. So it's really a lot more complicated. I mean, fair housing is a start. Like you said, it's not just legal. It takes community effort too, and a commitment from the guys that have the power and the money to see value in it too. So I hope that helps a little bit. But also, I have a question for you as far as, I don't know about housing vouchers. I know about Section 8 and all that. I'm curious that as a significant group of the population is aging and is moving on to retirement and Social Security and all that, how do you think that's going to affect like Section 8 housing? Like, can Section 8 housing be used so that maybe somebody like me could stay in my neighborhood instead of moving when I get to be too old to be in my house?
Section 8 is designed to give vouchers for rentals, or Section 8, which is basically a housing authority giving any kind of discount. So if your area has significant rentals, it will try to help you to stay there in theory. Now, Chicago Housing Authority is not as good about letting you stay in your particular area that you're accustomed to as maybe some other housing authorities are, at least from what I've observed, anecdotal evidence, full disclosure. But so what Section 8 will do is it'll look at your income and it'll look at what you can afford for rent, and then in your area it will see how much they need to supplement, and then say, okay, your voucher says that you can get a rent rate of like, say, $1,100. So for you and all your stuff, and considering all these other factors and your other sources of income. So then you can go to a rental place, and please keep in mind in Cook County, if somebody says they don't accept vouchers, you report the heck out of them. I'm so tired of the crap. I'm so tired of it. I've had so many people come up to me and they'll be like, do you accept vouchers? And I said, well, it's the law in Cook County, so of course we accept them. You still have to pass a credit and criminal check, and your income has to work with the rent rate we're offering, but we still accept it. And you wouldn't be surprised how many people, even who don't take apartment, are so happy to hear that I am following the law. It's just so sad. But to get back to answer your question, Section 8 works primarily with rentals. If your area has the rental rate that your housing authority is willing to give you, then they will help you. However, it depends on how the housing authority is managed and what their priorities are. If their priorities are, we want to just have a bunch of money of property management and then scheme however we want, you will have an issue. If they genuinely are trying to make sure that the area is diverse within socioeconomic status, and that's their goal, you're more likely to have a sufficient amount of help. So, yeah.
Hello again.
Hello again.
I just wanted to follow up on my first question. So I'm wondering if there isn't any way to like anonymously file a complaint against a company, and if you were in a tough position where you saw like a terrible infraction, like just hypothetically, like, and you felt like you had to report it. Like, shouldn't it be illegal for them to like fire you over reporting it?
Yeah. So technically, it is illegal for them to fire me if they found out I filed a complaint. And in theory, especially if I was working with a private charity that sponsors fair housing, I should be able to do that. However, that doesn't mean, the offices for a lot of rental companies are very small. The office that I had some of the worst issues in was someone who was the first person who taught me fair housing, and then when I went to another company, suddenly she's just a horrible example of it. There's only 3 of us. So they'd figure out really quickly who did it. And it definitely wasn't going to be the maintenance team. It was definitely going to be one of us in the office. So there was, and I won't go into the personal specifics of it on this podium, but if you talk to me later at the coffee hour, which I'll make sure I run out there before everything's over, yeah, no, there's no way they wouldn't have known it's me. So I'm just such a dork about stuff, including ethics. So they would have known for a fact it's me. Now, in general, you probably can do it anonymously, but I would suggest if you want to do it anonymously, I would talk to a private charity first, because I'm not familiar with the protocol with HUD. I will say with the one HUD audit I was a part of, we knew exactly who it was. And it wasn't because of the complaint, it was because their name and their address was in the complaint. So if you want to do it privately, what might be a better solution for my situation if it got super egregious is that if I went to a private organization like the ones I mentioned earlier and said, hey, can you investigate my property? I work there, I'm stuck there, but if you investigate it, I think you'll find that the leasing agents have some discriminatory bias. And then they can send their own plants to investigate it and then bring up a complaint that in theory would have nothing to do with me. And then if I can, during their process, I could go find a new job and then testify against my old company. Yeah, so. Hey. Hey, buddy.
Hey, Glenda, good talk.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I just have like a question. I guess like you went a lot about like white flight and things like that. What about like gentrification? Like what can we do to go fight gentrification and make it to where it doesn't displace people of color? Right.
Well, gentrification is really an issue when it comes to the ideals of capitalism as they're implemented in America, when I think of it. And so, yeah. Can you tell I went to Vassar? So my suggestion for that is with gentrification, a lot of it is basically a lot of people saying, hey, this place is cheap and hip. And then because it gets popular, it's no longer cheap, but it's still very hip. And then everything accommodates towards that market because everything's driven by the perceived wants. So it's tough. You know, gentrification can do a lot of places for a certain area, but what you really need to be careful of is private landlords raising their rents and then displacing those populations. So what I would suggest is find ways in your local community, if you want to prevent gentrification, that will encourage landlords, kind of like what Oak Park did, like my mom said, and encourage them to not raise the rent rates too high on their old tenants, and encourage new people to support the community that they're already living in. Instead of going to, like in New York, where Harlem is now not nearly as culturally significant as it was before because a bunch of young people moved into the low rent rates and like, look, I'm so hip, I live in Harlem, oh my God. And instead, yeah, I'm sure they talk just like that. So, but instead, you go to them and you say, look, say you move to a place that has a huge jazz community. You encourage new people to participate, invest, and encourage that jazz community. So then instead of having a hip place that has to lose that jazz influence, you have a bunch of new people invested in what the community was already good at and making it more authentically what it was and continuing a history that will evolve over time instead of shutting down one story for a new story. So, that's it?
That's it. Thank you very much.
So, one more thing. I always feel bad for speakers who aren't able to get to the coffee hour, so I'm literally just going to run right out there. So if you have more questions, I'm just going to be there now.